On the night of March 24, 1944, the sky over Germany was a chaotic canvas of flak bursts and searchlights. Inside the glass bubble of an Avro Lancaster's rear turret, Flight Sergeant Nicholas Alkemade was a lonely sentinel. He was the tail gunner, the man tasked with spotting the predators in the dark, but on this night, the predator had already found him. A Junkers Ju-88 night fighter had raked the bomber with cannon fire, turning the Lancaster into a flying furnace. Alkemade, just 21 years old, felt the searing heat before he saw the flames. When he turned to grab his parachute from its stowage rack, his heart stopped. The locker was engulfed in a roaring orange wall of fire. The silk canopy, his only ticket back to Earth, was already melting into a blackened, useless lump of fabric. The situation was a mathematical certainty of death. The aircraft was spiraling out of control, and the cockpit was an inferno. Alkemade had two options, and both ended at zero. He could stay in his turret and be incinerated as the bomber struck the ground, a fate of agonizing, prolonged screaming. Or he could rotate his turret, open the doors, and step backward into the freezing abyss of the night. At 18,000 feet, the air is thin and the temperature is minus 40 degrees. Alkemade looked at the flames licking at his flight suit and then looked at the vast, uncaring darkness behind him. To a man trapped in a furnace, the void looked like a mercy. He didn't jump with the hope of living. He jumped because he wanted a clean death. He wanted the cold air to put out the fire on his clothes and the impact to be so instantaneous that his brain wouldn't have time to register the pain. "I had the choice of staying with the aircraft or jumping out," Alkemade later recalled with a chillingly British stoicism. "If I stayed, I would be burned to death. My clothes were already well alight and my face and hands burnt, though at the time I scarcely noticed the pain due to the high state of excitement. I decided to jump and end it all as quickly and cleanly as I could." Without a harness, without a cord to pull, and with his skin peeling from the heat, Nicholas Alkemade somersaulted backward into the slipstream. He was 3.4 miles above the earth. As the burning Lancaster vanished into the clouds above him, he entered a state of terminal velocity, roughly 120 miles per hour, falling into a darkness so profound it felt like he was already dead. He had nearly 2 minutes of consciousness left to contemplate the end of his life as the German forest rushed up to meet him. Nicholas Alkemade wasn't a decorated ace or a high-ranking officer with a chest full of medals. He was a 21-year-old former market gardener from Loughborough, a man whose pre-war life revolved around the quiet rhythms of soil and seeds. In the hierarchy of a Lancaster crew, the tail gunner was often the youngest and most exposed, literally sitting outside the main fuselage in a cramped, frigid glass cage. It was a job that required a specific kind of mental fortitude, the ability to sit in total isolation for 10 hours, staring into the blackness for the flicker of an enemy engine. By March 1944, Alkemade was a seasoned member of the 115 Squadron. He understood the grim statistics of Bomber Command, where the life expectancy of a rear gunner was measured in weeks, not months. He was a practical man, not a mystic. When the fire consumed his parachute, he didn't pray for a miracle. He performed a cold, rational cost-benefit analysis of his own death. This stoic pragmatism is what makes Alkemade such a compelling figure for your video. He represents the everyman, thrust into an impossible physical paradox. He wasn't trying to be a hero. He was simply a man who preferred the dignity of the open sky to the horror of the furnace. This lack of ego is exactly what would later baffle his German captors. As he fell, the physical sensations were overwhelming. The 120 miles per hour wind acted as a coolant for his burnt hands and face, a strange, fleeting relief. Because it was a moonless night and he was falling through a void, he had no visual reference points. There was no sensation of falling, only the roar of the wind in his ears and the smell of singed wool from his flight suit. In those nearly 2 minutes of freefall, Alkemade experienced a surreal sense of peace. He later described it as a pleasant, drifting sensation. He was reconciled with his fate. He thought of his family, the cold air of the English countryside, and the strange turn his life had taken, from a gardener tending to roses to a human meteor plunging toward the Third Reich. He was prepared for the lights to go out. He was prepared for the impact that would turn his body into a footnote of the air war. What he wasn't prepared for was the series of impossible, coincidences that were waiting for him at the bottom of those 18,000 feet. Terminal velocity for a human being is a terrifying physical ceiling. At roughly 120 miles per hour, the air resistance pushing up matches the pull of gravity pulling down. For Nicholas Alkemade, this meant he was no longer accelerating. He was simply a 170-pound projectile slicing through the freezing German night. He had been falling for nearly 90 seconds, long enough for the initial adrenaline spike to fade into a strange, detached lucidity. As he descended through the cloud deck at 4,000 feet, the absolute darkness of the high atmosphere gave way to a hazy, gray-green blur. The ground was no longer an abstract concept, it was a looming reality. Most people who fall from such heights lose consciousness due to the sheer psychological trauma or the lack of oxygen, but Alkemade remained wide awake. He watched the earth rush toward him with the calm of a spectator watching a film. Then, the miracle began with the sound of snapping wood. Alkemade didn't hit the flat, unforgiving iron of the German permafrost. By a margin of a few yards, he plummeted directly into a dense thicket of young fir trees. The branches acted as a series of natural shock absorbers. As he crashed through the canopy, the pine boughs whipped against his flight suit, each one snapping and absorbing a fraction of his kinetic energy. It was a violent, chaotic descent, a cacophony of breaking timber and tearing fabric, that lasted only a fraction of a second but felt like an eternity. After the trees had stripped away his momentum, Alkemade hit the final safety net, a massive, waist-deep drift of fresh, powdery snow. The snow acted as a hydraulic cushion, compressing under his weight and bringing his body to a gentle, cushioned halt. He lay there in the silence of the forest, the only sound the distant, muffled thud of his Lancaster exploding miles away. He waited for the pain to start. He waited for the darkness of death to finally claim him. When it didn't come, he cautiously opened his eyes. Above him, he could see the hole he had punched through the pine branches, a vertical tunnel leading back up to the stars. With a movement that defied every law of orthopedic medicine, Alkemade reached into his pocket. His hands were burnt, his flight suit was in tatters, and he was covered in pine needles and frost, but he was alive. He pulled out his tin of cigarettes, struck a match, and took a long, trembling drag. He was a man who had just fallen from the height of 5 Burj Khalifas without a parachute, and his first instinct was to sit in the snow and have a smoke. He had survived the fall. Now, he just had to survive the Germans. The morning light brought the sound of crunching snow and the barking of German shepherds. When the German patrol stumbled upon Nicholas Alkemade, they didn't find a broken corpse or a terrified fugitive. They found a man sitting in a snowdrift, calmly nursing his injuries. To the German soldiers, he was just another downed terrorflieger, terrorflyer. They hauled him out of the woods and handed him over to the Gestapo, convinced he was a spy or a saboteur who had ditched his parachute and hidden it to blend in with the civilian population. Inside the sterile, cold interrogation room, the atmosphere was thick with hostility. The Gestapo officers demanded to know where he had hidden his umbrella. Alkemade, still dazed but maintaining his composure, told them the truth: "I didn't have one." The lead interrogator laughed. A fall from 18,000 feet without a parachute wasn't just unlikely, it was a physical impossibility. To the Gestapo, Alkemade was a liar who was mocking their intelligence. They accused him of being a high-level agent and threatened him with execution if he didn't reveal his landing site and the location of his hidden gear. No human being hits the earth at 120 miles per hour and walks away with nothing but a twisted knee and a few scratches. Alkemade didn't flinch. "Check the wreckage," he told them. "The parachute is still in the plane." Intrigued by his unwavering confidence, the Germans sent a team to the crash site of the Lancaster. They found the charred remains of the bomber scattered across a field near Mesjid. As they sifted through the blackened aluminum of the rear turret section, they found exactly what Alkemade had described. Inside the twisted, melted locker was the unmistakable metal frame of a parachute pack. The silk was gone, incinerated by the fire, but the metal ripcord and the harness were still fused to the aircraft. The realization hit the German investigators like a physical blow. The distance from the altitude of the attack to the ground was verified. The flight logs were checked. The physics were recalculated. Nicholas Alkemade had indeed plummeted 3.5 miles through the atmosphere and survived. The mood in the interrogation room shifted instantly from suspicion to awe. In the middle of a brutal total war, the German military, even the hardened Luftwaffe officers, retained a deep, chivalrous respect for flyers. They brought Alkemade out of his cell, but not for execution. They brought him out to show him to the other prisoners and the guards. They treated him as a living legend, the man who had beaten the sky itself. They even provided him with a signed certificate of authenticity, a document stating that they had personally verified his 18,000-foot fall, ensuring that no one would ever doubt his story again. Nicholas Alkemade's war did not end with his fall. It ended in the confines of Stalag Luft III, the same prisoner of war camp made famous by the Great Escape. However, Alkemade didn't need to dig tunnels to earn the respect of his fellow inmates or his captors. He carried with him a piece of paper that was more valuable than any currency in the camp, a handwritten testimonial from the Luftwaffe, signed and witnessed, confirming that he had fallen 18,000 feet without a parachute and lived. To the other Allied prisoners, he was a walking talisman of hope. If a man could survive a 3.5-mile plunge into a Nazi forest, perhaps the war itself wasn't as certain a death sentence as they feared. Even the German guards would occasionally stop Alkemade just to look at him, as if trying to see the invisible armor that had protected him from the laws of gravity. He had become a living anomaly, a human glitch in the cold machinery of 1940s warfare. When the war finally drew to a close and Alkemade returned to England, he didn't seek out the spotlight. He returned to his quiet life, eventually working in a chemical plant. Ironically, the man who survived a fall from the stratosphere found himself in more danger on the ground than he ever was in the air. Over the years, he survived a massive chemical explosion, a severe electrical shock that knocked him unconscious, and a falling bale of industrial material that nearly crushed him. It seemed as though death was constantly reaching for him, only to find that Alkemade was simply too stubborn to grab its hand. Nicholas Alkemade passed away in 1987 at the age of 64, not from a fall, but from natural causes in his own bed. His legacy remains one of the most cited cases in the study of human survival and terminal velocity. Skeptics often try to calculate the math of his survival, the exact flexibility of the fir branches, the moisture content of the snow, the drag of his flight suit, but the numbers never quite add up to a 100% guarantee of life. Ultimately, his story is the patient zero for the limits of human resilience. It serves as a reminder to your audience that sometimes, when every technical system fails and every piece of equipment is gone, the sheer will to accept one's fate can lead to a miracle. Alkemade didn't survive because he fought the fall. He survived because he accepted it, and in that acceptance, the universe seemed to offer him a soft place to land. The legacy of Nicholas Alkemade is more than just a footnote in a military archive. It is a permanent challenge to our understanding of human survival. In the years following 1945, Alkemade's story became a staple of aviation medicine and physics lectures. Scientists and researchers have spent decades trying to replicate the math of his survival. They calculate the drag coefficient of his heavy flight suit, the specific tensile strength of young German fir branches, and the compressive displacement of fresh snow. Yet, every time the numbers are crunched, the conclusion remains the same. Alkemade should have been killed instantly. His survival became the patient zero for a very specific type of miracle, the terminal velocity survivor. It changed the way the military thought about hopeless situations. Alkemade's case proved that the human body, under the most extreme and specific set of variables, can endure forces that should theoretically liquefy bone and organ tissue. It gave birth to a grim but hopeful saying among air crews: "It's not the fall that kills you, it's the sudden stop." Alkemade simply managed to turn a sudden stop into a staged deceleration. But the man himself remained remarkably unburdened by his legendary status. When he returned to England, he didn't join the lecture circuit or sell his soul to the tabloids. He went back to work, choosing the relative anonymity of a chemical plant. However, it seemed as though the universe wasn't quite done testing him. In a series of events that would be dismissed as bad writing in a movie, Alkemade survived 3 more near-death experiences at his job. He was caught in a massive chemical explosion that leveled part of his plant. He walked away. He was hit by a falling bale of material that should have crushed his skull. He walked away. He was even subjected to a massive electrical shock that sent him into a deep coma. He woke up, asked for a cigarette, and went back to work. These post-war incidents added a layer of mysticism to his legacy. People began to wonder if his fall from the Lancaster hadn't just saved his life, but somehow made him unkillable. He became a symbol of British resilience, a man who looked at the most terrifying aspects of the 20th century, from the Gestapo to high-voltage industrial accidents, and simply refused to blink. Nicholas Alkemade passed away in 1987 of natural causes, a peaceful end for a man who had spent his youth falling through the sky at 120 miles per hour. His story remains a cornerstone of your video's narrative because it offers the ultimate engagement hook. It is a story that sounds like a lie, is proven by the enemy, and defies every law of science. As you close this section of your video, remind the audience that Alkemade's greatest gift wasn't the luck of the trees or the snow, it was the moment of peace he found at 18,000 feet. He survived because he didn't panic. He accepted the end, and the world gave him a new beginning.